Yep, so we are starting with spread 1B today, talking about scientific research methodologies. So research methodology sounds like a really confusing thing, but it just means how we are conducting that particular research investigation. Because remember, in psychology or in any of the sciences, not everything that we conduct or not every way that we try to gather data is through is through an experiment. For example, maybe in lower year levels, you guys might have done surveys in class. You might have interviewed people. Okay, you might have done a petition to collect information or data. So those are different research methodologies, or basically methods we use to collect research or collect data. Okay, not every single thing that we do is going to be an experiment or is going to be like, in a controlled setting that experiments are. Okay, now according to our study design, we only need to know about a few types of studies or a few types of methodologies there. And those are the ones we're going to be covering today. So you might come across other ones in resources and stuff, but if it's not in our PowerPoint, if it's not in the book, you don't need to know about it. Okay, so we're going to learn about what each one is. So you need to be able to describe or define each one. And then you also need to be able to evaluate. So if you remember, evaluate means to give an advantage and a disadvantage. So for each of the ones that we're going through today, if you just know like one advantage and one disadvantage, you should be all good. Okay. So these are all the types of research methodologies you have. So as you can see, the main ones that we always do, are experiments. Okay, these are the ones we usually have in our research scenarios, but that doesn't mean that we can't collect information through other methods. So all these other methods can also be used to collect data, okay, can also be used to generate some kind of information, okay? However, a lot of the research scenarios we do in SACS, we do as practice questions, are experiments because they're the most commonly kind of assessed one, if that makes sense. Okay, so these are all the different types of research methodologies we're going to go through today. So the first one is experiments. We all know what an experiment is. An experiment basically is a very controlled way. Controlled means that we do it under controlled conditions, like in a lab or in a room where we can control the climate, we can control the noise, we can control the lighting, okay? And experiments often assess a specific type of relationship called the cause-effect relationship, okay? And we said that the cause is usually the IV and the effect is usually the DV there. Okay, so obviously every experiment, whichever scenario we give you on any experiment, will always be able to have a clear IV and will always be able to have a clear DV there. So that's basically the experiment. Now we know that with advantages, obviously if I'm conducting an experiment in a lab, it's a lot easier for me to control the variables. Like I can adjust the lighting if it's too bright and hurting some people's eyes. If I can adjust the AC or the heater if it's too cold or too hot and that's influencing the participants in my study. If I'm doing something outside, like in the actual open ground or in the courtyard, I won't be able to control those variables, okay? So an experiment allows me to do that. So those are some of the advantages of experiments, or the things that are good, basically. Disadvantages are the things that are probably a drawback of doing an experiment. Obviously, we know that although we have an IV and a clear DV in an experiment, we also have our unwanted variables. And we'll learn more about these when we come back to school on Tuesday, which are the extraneous and the potential confounding variables, okay? So these unwanted variables can actually affect our results in an unwanted way, okay? They can affect our ability to make a proper generalization of those results. Also, some variables cannot be measured accurately, no matter how hard we try. So even if I want to assess something like emotion in my participants, some people are really good at hiding their emotions. So some variables like emotions, happiness, love, sadness, these things we can't really accurately 100% be certain that we're measuring those things in a very precise way, okay, because those things are so subjective there. So that's what an experiment is, okay, and that's probably one that we know really well. The next type of way we can collect data, or the next type of research methodology, is called a self-report, and we learned about this last year. You would remember a self-report is just a general word or a general term given to any research methodology, any way that we collect data that involves the participant writing, okay, just writing in a book, maybe writing in a diary, or speaking. So maybe speaking through like an interview, asking questions, doing a survey, like verbally, like that. Okay, self-reports use a range of methods to get information. Okay, so think of self-reports as the big category. And under that big category of self-reports, you've got questionnaires, you've got interviews, and you've got rating scales. So questionnaires, interviews, and rating scales, they're all just examples of self-reports. They're not really separate methodologies as such. They're just examples of self-reports. Okay, we're going to go through each of them in depth as well, but that's just for your understanding there. An advantage of self-reports, obviously, when you're asking someone to write about themselves, or you're asking and you're talking to them through an interview or doing a survey with them, they are going to give you a lot of information, and often that information is going to be quite rich in detail. You can also be very emotive with them. You can kind of like speak to them like you were speaking to a friend, and they might be very comfortable and feel comfortable to give you more information. So that's one of the advantages. Also with self-reports, like in a questionnaire, you might have both a mix of quantitative and qualitative data. So you can put a question in there like, describe using adjectives how you feel. So that would be qualitative, because then you're describing. Or you could say on a scale of 1 to 10, how stressed did you feel during the lockdown? So then that would be quantitative, because then you're using a rating, which is a number. A disadvantage of self-reports, we know, is that a lot of the time there can be biased responses. So a participant might do a personality test, and he might say, okay, rate how outgoing you think you are. And even if you're not a really outgoing person, or even if you're not really a friendly person, you might actually judge yourself as being more friendly than you are, either because you don't want to admit to yourself that you're not a friendly person, or because you don't want the researcher to know that about you. Okay, so a lot of the time people can actually lie on self-reports. Okay, and there's nothing that we can do as a researcher to really stop that from happening. So that is basically the self-report. Also, depending on how clear the questions are, obviously, if you don't have a good question, you're not going to get a good answer. So if you've given a person a survey or a questionnaire to do, and on that survey, your questions are really ambiguously worded, really difficult to understand. Like I'm giving you a survey and I'm using words that you'd need a dictionary to understand what that question means. That is a disadvantage of a self-report, okay? So you always have to make sure your self-report, whatever you're doing, is always clear and easy for the participant to understand. So looking at the different types of self-reports. Now, questionnaires, as the name suggests, a questionnaire is just a written set of questions about a specific topic of research interest. You can literally do a questionnaire about anything. Could be about stress, could be about how satisfied you are with a job, could be about, you could even do a questionnaire about the food at the canteen, literally. It could be like anything, any topic, okay? Questionnaires are often conducted anonymously, and you can probably understand why we would want to do it anonymously. A lot of the time when people know that the researcher or the person in charge is going to get those results, it's better they don't write their name on that piece of paper, or if it's online, it's better they don't type their name online, because then they might not be honest, okay? Obviously, if the person knows, like if I'm your teacher and I'm asking you to do a questionnaire about the teaching methods we use in class, you might feel maybe less inclined to be honest if your name was on the paper, because you know, okay, Ms. Faroon's going to look through it, she's going to read the comments, okay? So a lot of the time questionnaires are conducted anonymously. Questionnaires are also most commonly conducted through surveys, okay? So surveys, questionnaires, they're kind of like synonyms for each other for the purposes of this spread. They're kind of the same thing. So obviously with questionnaires, similar to self-reports, because questionnaires are a type of self-report, honestly, the advantages and disadvantages are very similar for all of them. So advantage is that it's very easy to create, it's easy to conduct. Disadvantage is just like a normal self-report, people can lie, people can just tick any box or write anything just to get it over and done with because they can't be bothered. Okay, so they might not take it seriously. Okay, and because it's anonymous, this actually not only increases the risk of, this not only has a good thing of people being honest, but it also has a bad thing that people will just write whatever they want because we can't track them down. Okay, so that's a questionnaire. The next type of self-report we look at is interviews. So we all know what interviews are. Interviews can be done, verbally, where you're sitting with the person speaking to them. They can be done over the phone. Obviously, in today's world, we can even do interviews on Zoom. Okay, so interviews can be done in that way. Interviews, similar to questionnaires, just get a person's responses on a specific topic. Okay, so an advantage of interviews is that it does allow for collection of data on sensitive issues. For example, if I know that one student is struggling with something in class, rather than actually addressing the whole class, I can get that student and kind of like talk to them one-on-one, like an interview, okay? It can be more interactive because it's one-on-one. The participant feels like they're speaking to this real person rather than just writing their answers on a paper. And obviously, as the interviewer, I can actually use, for example, a really nice tone of voice, really nice use of emotion there to be able to make the participant feel more comfortable, to, you know, see, to make sure that they don't feel awkward or in a state of feeling uncomfortable, basically. Okay, disadvantage though is that because interviews are usually conducted one-on-one, they are a lot more time consuming. Just think about it this way. Like if I was to do a questionnaire, I just print out 20 copies of that questionnaire, hand it to you in class, within half an hour, everyone's done. Whereas if I was to do a one-on-one interview with all 20 or 22 of you, it would obviously be a lot more time consuming, okay? It would take a few days to do that. So interviews are not good for gathering information for large samples or large numbers of people there, okay? They're more good if you're only dealing with maybe 2 or 3 or 4 people there. So that's the interview. Another example of a self-report. And another, or the last example of a self-report is rating scale. So rating scales basically, we know what they are. They basically allow you to choose a number to determine how you're feeling about something. For example, you know, rating scale. So how important are the following issues for you personally? So if improving water quality, you know, not improving water quality, sorry, let's look at another one. If protection of endangered species is quite an issue that's important and it's close to your heart, you might circle number 9 there, okay? Because it's close to being very extremely important for you. Now, rating scales are not only with numbers, we can also just use normal descriptions like agree, strongly disagree, okay? So we can use a mixture of either qualitative or quantitative information there when we make a rating scale. An advantage is obviously similar to a questionnaire. They're quick and inexpensive. Inexpensive means that they're quite cheap. They don't require a lot of spending money or a lot of wasting money to conduct these, okay? They're easy to kind of create on Microsoft Word or any program you have. And similar to questionnaires and unlike interviews, you can actually use rating scales to collect information from large samples of people. In fact, a lot of your rating scales are actually used in questionnaires. So in a survey, you might have a rating scale. So they're not used separately, but they're kind of used in conjunction with one another. A disadvantage though, again, is laziness, okay? If you've ever done a questionnaire like this, if you've ever done a questionnaire that has rating scales like this, and I'm pretty sure you guys have done this, you know, whenever you have those Elevate sessions, whenever you have like a seminar or a workshop and they ask you for feedback afterwards, usually you have to do something like this with the feedback. So a lot of the time what happens is convenience bias can occur. And convenience bias is literally just a fancy way of saying that you're being lazy, okay? It's when you just literally tick the same thing for each box. So you might do a pattern where you tick like go diagonal like that, but you're not really reading the question. You're just kind of like ticking whatever box kind of falls into your cursor there. Okay. So that's obviously convenience bias, and that's going to lead to inaccurate results because the person is just choosing anything rather than actually choosing the correct option that reflects their thoughts or feelings. Okay. So that's obviously the rating scales, and that's our last type of self-report. Moving out of self-reports now, another type of way we can collect data is through observational study. So observational study, as the name suggests, involves observing or watching somebody doing something and then noting down the consequences of their action. So as we've already covered the observational theory of learning in Unit 3 Outcome 2, you should already have an understanding of how we can learn through observation and how we can collect data from observation. There are 2 main types of observation. Naturalistic means that we observe the person in the real life natural setting. Controlled means that we take those people that we want to observe and we put them in a structured setting like a lab. If you remember last year when we did the strange situation experiment with the baby and the mum and the stranger, remember? And then the mum would often leave the room and the baby would be left behind with the stranger. That was an example of a controlled environment, okay? That wasn't the baby's real house. That was just a lab that was set up to look like a little playroom with toys and things. Okay, that was controlled. If we were to have done that in the baby's actual house, then that would be naturalistic observation because we're using that real life setting that that baby lives in. Okay, similarly, if I was going to do an observational study on behaviors in kindergarten children, going to the actual kindergarten, just sitting in the playground, pretending that I'm one of the teachers or student teachers there, that would be naturalistic observation. But taking those kindergarten children out of the kindergarten, taking them to a lab, putting them in another room that's not in the kindergarten, that would then be controlled, because now I'm taking them out of the natural setting. Now, obviously, an advantage is that, especially if you're using naturalistic observation, you can understand behavior as it occurs in a natural context. And it can give you a realistic and genuine insight into what that behavior is. Disadvantage, though, is that if the participant knows that they're being observed. So if I'm sitting there in the kindergarten playground and the child's like, wait a second, that's someone who's never been here before, and they start to suspect that I'm probably someone from outside who's come to observe them, the child might maybe be a little bit more friendlier with children that they maybe normally bully or that they maybe normally push around, okay, in order to maybe impress me or in order to show a different side of them. So obviously we don't want their behavior to change. And for that, obviously, that can be a disadvantage. Okay, so that is the observational study. The next one that we look at is case studies. So we've already done case studies. We did some this year as well. We did some last year. If you remember, we did Jeannie, the little girl who was locked in the basement until she was found by social services at about the age of 13. We did Phineas Gage last year, the guy who had the iron rod going through his head. This year, we also did HM, Henry Molaison, the guy who literally had anterograde amnesia because of the removal of his hippocampus. Okay, so many different case studies we've done. Case studies are different from all the other types of studies because they're an in-depth investigation on a single person or maybe a single small group of people. So it's an in-depth investigation, which means that it's probably done over a few years, over decades, over maybe even multiple decades, okay, 30, 40, 50 years. The good thing about case studies is we can generate a lot of detailed information. But the only problem is that that detailed information is often only about one person, okay, or a small group of people. It's not information that we can then generalize, okay? The reason we can't generalize this information from a case study is that a lot of the time people that are the subject of case studies like Jeannie or HM or, you know, Phineas Gage in this picture here, whatever happened to them doesn't happen naturally, okay? It's not natural or normal or common or typical for parents to lock their kids up in the basement and for them only to be found when they're 13 years old, which is what happened to Jeannie, okay? That's not common. So whatever we study about Jeannie in those years that she was up, in the years after she was found, we can't generalize that back to the normal population because what happened to her isn't normal in the first place, okay? And for that reason, that is one of the disadvantages, that these disorders or these conditions or these experiences these people go through are not common. And so we can't generalize that information or that data back to the common or wider population. That's the case study. Longitudinal studies are, as the name suggests, they happen over a long period of time. Long period of time means you're studying that person over time, okay? There was a study, there's a TV show called Up, not Up really, it's a documentary series, not the Disney Up, not the old man and the balloons and everything. It's another thing. It's called Up documentary series. And what they did was they took a bunch of kindergarten aged children, not kindergarten, sorry, they were in grade 2 when they started. So they took a bunch of children when they were about 7 years old in grade 2, and that was in 1964, and studied them every 7 years or so until they reached 63 years old. And so obviously the longitudinal study started in 1964 and ended in 2019. And every 7 years, they were going back and interviewing these kids, and you would see how their emotional responses would change, how their social responses would change, even how their physical appearance would change. So one year the kids would have like a different hairstyle, the next year they'd have a different hairstyle or different style of fashion or different, different like expressions. So again, the longitudinal study helped to show the changes in their development. And that's basically what we use longitudinal studies for, to understand the progression of development, okay, from when you're a baby to when you obviously get older or you reach old age. Question, can't we say that case studies are a type of longitudinal study? No, not necessarily, because longitudinal studies, well, think of it this way. A case study can be considered similar to a longitudinal study in that we might study that person with the uncommon condition for a long period of time. But a longitudinal study can never really be a case study, because when we study longitudinal study, we study normal development, okay, a normal progression of development. If I'm studying somebody who's got an abnormal condition and I'm studying them over a long period of time, I'd probably classify that as a case study rather than a longitudinal study, okay? So just think of it that way. It's a little bit different there. So when we're looking at, you know, the advantages and disadvantages, longitudinal studies, because you're studying that person over a long period of time, obviously you can generate a lot of information about them. And also because the same participants are being followed or tracked for research, like this man here, this was him, okay, when he was young. And the same with the other people in that picture. You're studying the same person. So even though that person might change slightly, it's still the same person you're studying, similar to a repeated measures design where individual participant differences are less because you're using the same participant in both conditions of the study. Longitudinal studies are good because there's not much individual participant differences that come up, okay? Disadvantage though is obviously it is very time consuming. People might drop out of the study. Okay, this lady, for example, she obviously was in the whole study, but let's imagine that when she was 20 years old, she was like, I don't want to be followed anymore. Get lost, get out of my life. And she just drops out. So then you've lost all that valuable data that you collected on this girl from when she was maybe 7 to up till the age of maybe 21. You've lost all that information. It's no longer valid. Okay, people can drop out and we call that participant attrition. Okay. Also, obviously, potential confounding variables can come up. So maybe this person experiences a really traumatic life event and then says, okay, I don't want to be in the study anymore. Or this lady experiences, you know, this lady maybe dies early, okay, and then her data is no longer valid. So again, it really like, there's a lot of factors that can affect a longitudinal study. The basic idea being that whenever something drags out for too long, the chances of that thing continuing are going to be obviously be less compared to just getting it quickly done and over with. Okay, one more thing. The next thing that we're going to look at is a little bit different, but just remember that a longitudinal study is like a film strip of a person's life. So if you were to take my life from when I was born to like now, it'll be almost like watching a movie of my life. Like, okay, Miss Faroween at 7 years old, Miss Faroween at 10 years old, Miss Faroween at 15 years old, and you're just watching like a movie, okay? So think of a longitudinal study as being similar to that, like a film strip or a movie. A cross-sectional study is different, okay? And the main difference between a longitudinal study and a cross-sectional study, which are often confused by most students, is that a cross-sectional study only assesses or looks at a behavior or a person at a single point in time. So for example, if we go off the previous scenario, talking about maybe my development or Miss Faroween's development in 2019, just 1 year, okay? It doesn't have the word long in the actual name. So obviously it's not a longitudinal study. It's just a single point in time, which is a single year, maybe 2019. Or if I talk about you guys, I talk about maybe looking at your VCE experience in 2020, which was the year of the prolonged COVID lockdown, okay? And because we're only looking at a person's behavior, or, you know, we're looking at a variable at a single point in time, it's not a movie, but rather a snapshot. Okay, it's just like I took a single picture of your life in 2020 and that was the snapshot. It doesn't tell me anything about what happened to you before 2020. It doesn't tell me anything about what's going to happen to you after 2020. It's just 2020 or just 2019. Okay, at that single point in time, that's the main difference. Okay, it's a cross section. It's a single section or a single point in time, whereas a longitudinal study is long. It could go over decades. It could go over 20, 30, 40 years. Okay, now, because cross-sectional studies only look at a snapshot of a person's thoughts, feelings, or behavior at a single point in time, like 2020, 2019, cross-sectional studies are most commonly used to study age-related differences. Okay, for example, if I was to do a cross-sectional study, I might look at stress levels experienced by different year levels in 2018. Maybe we'll change that to 2020. To make it more recent. Okay, 2020 we know was a really chaotic year. So if I'm going to do a study of, okay, stress levels in high school students in 2020, I might take year 9 students, year 10 students, year 11 students. I might even take some year 12 students there too. Okay, and as I look at stress levels here, 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 and here, all I'm really getting is a snapshot of what these kids experienced in 2020 in terms of their stress. I have no idea what they experienced in 2017 or 2018 or any other year, only 2020. That's what makes it a cross-sectional study. It's a snapshot of their stress levels in 2020. Advantages is obviously it's not expensive to run. It's quite cheap. So money-wise, you're pretty good. Okay. It can be set up and conducted quickly because obviously it's just 1 year. You're just looking at what they experienced in 1 year. You're not following them over decades or 20, 30, 40 years. Because it's not time consuming and because there's not such a big time commitment involved and because you're not being tracked or followed, there's less participants that are going to be withdrawing or dropping out of the study. Disadvantages, though, is that obviously different age groups may not necessarily be alike. So, for example, if I talk about COVID as affecting the stress levels of these students, there could be other variables. For example, maybe year 9s had NAPLAN going on and there was a lot of stress associated with that. Obviously, year 12s had the VCAR exams coming up. So they had extra variables or potential confounding variables there that acted as other variables other than COVID, okay, to affect their stress levels. So different age groups may not necessarily be alike. And again, you've got your EVs, so your extraneous variables and your potential confounding variables coming up as a result of this. Also, you've got the cohort effect. So if I'm doing another study on maybe a bigger age gap, these guys were close in age gap. If I'm doing a study on a family looking at the stress levels experienced by the grandma in 2020 and the 3 grandchildren, the grandma might have lived through many world wars. She might have experienced people she loved being killed in those wars. Okay, so as a result of that, she might have more experiences and more stress overall compared to these little kids who probably don't have much stress in their life because they're still quite little. They've still got everything kind of handed to them on a platter and it's quite an easy life for them. So the cohort effect is this idea that when you've got big age gaps involved, like you're doing a study with 10-year-olds and then you're doing a study with their parents, obviously there is going to be big differences there, okay? So that's basically the cross-sectional study. And again, yeah, just showing you a differentiation. So I already kind of stressed this before, but cross-sectional studies, different groups, but they're compared at the same time, like 2020, 2018. The longitudinal studies, the same group of people, for example, the same group of these 4 children who then later became adults, and we're just following the same group of people, okay, over time, so over 20, 30, 40 years. So that's the main difference between the two. I don't know why this slide just came here for no reason, but there's more designs in there. You know what, we'll do the designs on, let me see. Actually, you know what, let's cover them. So yeah, with the experimental group and control group, you guys know that the experimental group is the group that's exposed to the IV, okay? They're the group that is exposed to the experimental condition. The control group is not exposed to the experimental condition. So if I'm doing a study on the effect of eating chocolate on concentration, the experimental group will eat the chocolate because the chocolate's the IV. And obviously that's because they're the experimental group. If chocolate is the IV, okay, the experimental group will eat the chocolate. They'll have it. The control group will not have the chocolate because they are not exposed to the IV. Okay, that's the basic idea. And remember, CO for control, CO for the fact that it's used as a group for comparison, for comparing the results of the experimental group. Okay, so you can see here, if we're doing a study on the effect of music on sleep, if music is our independent variable, one group will listen to music before they sleep. The other group, you can see there's no music symbol here. So this is the control group. They don't listen to the music, okay? And all other variables like physical activity, what they eat, everything else should stay the same. If these don't stay the same, then obviously that's when you've got your potential confounding variables coming about, okay? So that's the basic idea between experimental groups and control groups. Now, experimental research designs, we've done this last year as well, but the basic idea, guys, is that this is just simply how we organize participants, okay? After we've selected our participants, we want to decide, okay, how are we going to put these participants into groups, okay? And remember that research designs are ways in which we organize our participants, okay? How we want to use our participants, in other words, in our study. And if you don't, and I told this to my year 11s as well, but it applies to you guys as well. Literally, if you don't want to learn these 3 slides in depth, at least learn this slide, because this slide is literally just the summary or literally the basic definition of what each design is, okay, and how each design is different. Obviously, I would want you to learn the others, but if you are so lazy or you've gotten to the point where you cannot fit any more information in your brain, that slide will cover you, in other words. Okay, so with the research designs, you not only need to know what they mean, but you also need to know an advantage and disadvantage, okay? This is why I say it's good to go through the detailed slides rather than just the basics, but again, up to you. So the independent groups design, we know it's when we've got two clear separate groups. So you've got one group and you've got another group. So that could be our experimental group, condition A. You've got your control group, condition B. Experimental group, for example, are in a quiet environment. So they've got the quiet please sign. Condition B is the control group. So they're not exposed to the IV. So maybe for that reason, they are listening to music, okay? Now, obviously, each group is independent of the other because each group has different participants. So you can see in this example here, experimental group has Alison, Kim, Aisha, and Rick. And these are different people from who's in the control group. In the control group, we've got Angela, Hans, Yuan, and Alpana. Okay, so I was going to say alpaca, Alpana. So then, yeah, basically, like we've got two separate groups. Yeah, so that basically means that they are different from each other, and because they're different, that's why we've got the not equal to sign. Okay, if group A is not equal to group B, as in we're not using the same people twice, you automatically know that's an independent groups design. One group is independent of the other. They're different participants in each. Okay. An advantage is obviously independent groups design is the easiest design to actually set up. It can be completed so quickly, set up so easily, doesn't require you to really spend a lot of money to set things up. And the chance of participants dropping out or withdrawing is low because you've set it up so quickly. The participants aren't like, oh my God, are you still setting us up? What's going to happen? Blah, blah, blah. Okay. The disadvantage is because we're using different participants in each group, you are going to have more individual participant differences. And we know that when there are more differences, when you bring participants to a study and there are a lot of individual differences in terms of their personality or traits or abilities, that can bring up your potential confounding variables, okay? So it can make the results perhaps less accurate in a way. That's the independent groups design. Now, take that thought and apply that to repeated measures design and understand that repeated measures design is the complete opposite of independent groups design. We've got the equal sign. It's the same participants. Scott is used in the experimental group. He also then goes to the control group. Magdi first does the experimental group condition and the tasks. A few days later, she comes again and does the control condition tasks. Kate, Oliver. We're literally just using the same participant twice. So first they go through the experimental condition, then they come back to the experiment and do the control condition. Automatically, you know that there will be less individual participant differences because you don't have 10 different people doing the experiment. You literally have 5 people because you're reusing each person, okay? The disadvantage though is because you're reusing that same person and because they've already gone through one condition, sometimes their performance or their ability to do a task in that experiment actually either gets better because they've practiced it, or they really get bored and they're like, oh my God, this is draining my life. Why do I have to do it again? And their performance goes down. Either way, it's an order effect and it's a potential confounding variable because their previous experience in that experiment, already having done one of the conditions, is affecting their results rather than their actual ability or actual capacity there. That's called an order effect. Okay, it's literally like if I ask you to do something in class, like a task, and then you come to class the next day and do the same thing again. Obviously, some of you who are still motivated are going to do good, right? Because you're doing the task for the second time. Some of you who are already bored of it the first time and you can't be bothered doing it again, you might do badly. Okay, and that is basically what an order effect is. That the order in which you complete the tasks does affect your performance in an unwanted way and overtakes the effect of that independent variable. The last design that we look at is the match participants design. So the match participant design is, as the name suggests, we're matching participants based on characteristics. So we're not using, identical twins here. We're just using normal people, 2 normal people in the population who have similar abilities. For example, if I take, I'm just using random names here. If I've got 2 participants called Scott and Sam, and I'm doing a test on the effect of alcohol consumption on driving ability, I want to make sure that their alcohol tolerance is the same, or I want to make sure that their driving ability is the same. So I might say, okay, Scott, how many years have you had your license? And he might say, oh, I've had it for 2 years. Then I might ask Sam, okay, how many years have you had your license? And he might say, oh yeah, 2 years as well. So I'm like, okay, perfect. It looks like you guys are similar in every other way. You guys are a match. Okay. And then obviously Scott might go through the experimental condition, and then Sam would go through the control condition. So one of each participants goes to one condition. Now, match participants design is good because obviously by matching participants on a similar skill or trait, we are obviously lowering the individual participant differences. And when we do that, we are lowering our potential confounding variables as well. So PCVs are getting lowered too. A disadvantage is obviously, even though that example took me a few seconds to make up, in real life, it's actually very hard to match two people that are the same, okay? For example, Sam might say, oh no, actually, I've only been driving for 1 year and 2 months. And then I'm like, oh crap, like I can't match you guys because Scott's got more driving experience than you. So it's actually, in reality, it's very hard, very time consuming. It takes a long time and costly as well, because you've got to get these participants from recruitment agencies sometimes in order for them to be similar in terms of their characteristics. Okay. Another issue is if Scott and Sam were a match, let's say, forget about that 1 year, 2 months. If they were a match and they were both driving for 2 years, but halfway through the study, Scott says, oh, I don't want to participate anymore. Obviously he has the right to withdraw. Automatically Sam's results become invalid. And I'll have to say, okay, Sam, sorry, I got to let you go as well, because now if one half of you is not there, then there's no point of the other half being there. Okay, so that's one of the disadvantages, one of the main disadvantages of the match participants design. Again, all I want you to know is one advantage and one disadvantage for each design. And again, similar to the independent groups design, sorry, just one more thing, is that one group is not identical to the other. So the really important thing for you guys to remember is we're not using the same person. Scott and Sam are not the same person. They're different people, but they have similar characteristics, and we match them on that similar characteristic. Even in this picture, you can see none of these people look, person A does not look like person one, person B does not look like person two in this group, okay, and so on and so forth. So that's really important for us to remember. This is just a summary table taken from your Edroller book, because you guys know I always copy paste the tables. Okay, so that's there for you. Again, just literally a repetition of what we went through. If you want more details about like the strengths and limitations, or you prefer to have it in a table format, again, this is taken from your book as well. And that covers 1B for us. So I'm just going to stop the recording here.